Hello, and welcome to the weekly economic brief. My name is Dr. Lindsay Piegza, Chief Economist at Stifel. Last week, the economic calendar was relatively light after back-to-back weeks of jam-packed and market-moving releases, with durable goods arguably acting as the highlight for the week. Headline durable goods orders fell 0.8 in September, following a similar decline in August. Year-over-year headline orders fell 2.1% in September, the largest annual decline in 3 months. The weakness, however, was largely concentrated in transportation, off more than 3% for the month. Thus, excluding transportation, durable goods orders rose 0.4% in September and increased 1.1% over the past 12 months, up from the 1% annual gain reported the month prior. Business investment, meanwhile, rose 0.5 in September, the strongest pace in 3 months. Year-over-year business investment increased 0.1, a minimal gain, but still a 2-month high. Bottom line, with ongoing volatility in transportation, headline orders posted a disappointing contraction at the end of Q3. More importantly, however, business investment remains solid, reflecting ongoing resilience in the consumer sector and, by extension, another solid round of corporate profits and activity, promoting a still positive, albeit slower pace of capital orders and spending. On the housing front, the latest sales data showed some further, somewhat unexpected weakness. Existing home sales unexpectedly fell 1% in September, dropping from 3.88 million to a 3.84 million unit pace at the end of the third quarter, the lowest level since October of 2010. Over the past 12 months, existing home sales remained firmly in the red, off 3.5% as of September, up only slightly from the 3.7% decline reported a month prior, and marking now more than 3 years of consecutive activity decline. Despite an ongoing drop in sales, however, from a price standpoint, the median cost of a previously owned home continued an upward ascent, climbing 3% in September from a year earlier to $405,000, albeit down somewhat from $414,000 in August and marking now a 6-month low. Since the start of the year, home prices are up roughly 7%, again averaging $405,000. While mortgage rates have slowed to about 6.5 as of late from a peak of near 8% in October of last year, with the nominal costs of housing still extremely elevated, affordability remains at a near all-time low. Speaking of borrowing costs, turning to fiscal policy, at least some on the street are forecasting a further backup in longer-dated yields, potentially taking the 10-year back to 5% in the coming months amid ongoing sticky inflation and ballooning budget deficits. Of course, the market did have a similar reaction to the notion of a bloated government balance sheet roughly a year ago, with the 10-year reaching a high of 5% back in October, amid another round of debt ceiling debates. However, as soon as the prospect of the Fed cutting interest rates sooner than later came to the surface, any concerns of out-of-control government spending fell to the wayside, allowing the 10-year to retreat back to a low of 380 about 2 months later. The renewed focus on government outlays and questions of sustainability comes amid the latest reports from the U.S. Treasury released last week Friday. According to the reports, the U.S. deficit for fiscal year 24 topped $1.8 trillion, the third largest federal deficit in U.S. history after fiscal year 2020 and 2021 amid the COVID pandemic. Again, according to the details in the report, the largest driver of the increase was a near 30% gain in interest costs, totaling $1.13 trillion, along with sizable growth in entitlements such as Social Security and Medicare, as well as military programs. While arguably necessary during the unprecedented times of the COVID pandemic, at this point, any further expansion of the government's balance sheet, while it may appeal to a particular cohort of the voting base, risks undermining longer-run potential growth, as well as complicating the Fed's ability to reinstate price stability at the 2% target. However, like the market, fears of ongoing pressures of inflation, either as a result of political factors or other, does not appear to be a primary concern, at least for some Fed officials. San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly, for example, said she sees no reason to take a pause in rate cuts at this juncture. Speaking at a Wall Street Journal event last week, Daly said she supports further interest rate cuts in an effort to stave off further weakness in the labor market, regardless of the lack of convincing evidence that inflation is on a sustainable track back to 2%. Of course, other Fed officials are not yet ready to drop the mission accomplished banner on price stability. Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic, for example, has voiced concerns over the recent acceleration in core price pressures, as well as a potential need to slow or even pause additional rate cuts near term. While Cleveland Fed President Beth Hammack has championed the Fed's progress on inflation thus far, but says inflation still is running well above the FOMC's 2% objective. This week, the economic calendar is quite robust, beginning today with the Dallas Fed National Activity Index, followed by wholesale inventories, the FHFA Home Price Index, the S&P Case-Shiller 20 City and National Home Price Indices, the JOLT survey or Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, and the Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index on Tuesday. Consumer confidence is expected to tick up slightly to a reading of 99 in October, potentially marking a 2-month high, but still well below the near-term peak of near 129 reached back in June of 21. Turning to Wednesday, we take a look at weekly mortgage applications and the first highlight of the week, the preliminary Q3 GDP report. GDP rose 3% in the second quarter, more than expected and marking a 2-quarter high. In the third quarter, given the ongoing resilience of the consumer, as well as relatively firm corporate profits and investment, GDP is expected to again rise 3%, potentially marking the first back-to-back readings of 3% growth or higher since the third quarter of 23. Also on Wednesday, pending home sales for September. And later in the week on Thursday, we'll take another look at weekly jobless claims after 2 weeks of elevated reports in the aftermath of Hurricanes Helene and Milton, along with the September personal income and consumption report and the latest read on the PCE, the Fed's preferred inflation gauge. Personal consumption is expected to rise 0.4 in September and 4.6% on an annual basis, a potential downtick from the 5.2% pace in August, albeit still very solid on a nominal basis and well within the range established since May of last year. Income, meanwhile, is expected to rise 0.4 in September and 5.2% year over year, also marking a potential downtick from the August pace of 5.6%, although still perpetuating the average pace of near 6% since the start of the year. And then the PCE is expected to rise 0.2 in September, following a lesser 0.1% gain the month prior and 2.1% on an annual basis, potentially marking a 0.1 of a percentage point decline from the pace reported in August. Stripping out food and energy, the core PCE is expected to rise 0.3 in September, also following a more benign 0.1% gain the month prior and 2.6% year over year, also a potential 0.1 of a percentage point improvement from the pace in August. And finally, on Thursday, the Chicago PMI report will be released before we turn to Friday and another key report of the week, the non-farm payroll report for October. After a larger than expected gain of 254,000 in September, non-farm payrolls are expected to rise a reduced 140 in October, potentially marking a 4-month low and potentially lowering the 3-month average from 186 to 184, a 2-month low. The unemployment rate, meanwhile, is expected to remain steady at 4.1% for the second consecutive month, still well below what the Fed designates as the full employment range, and perpetuating the notion of ongoing tight-ish labor market conditions. And average hourly earnings are expected to rise 0.3 in October, following a 0.4% gain in September, resulting in a 4% increase over the past 12 months and potentially matching the gain in September. Also on Friday, the S&P Global U.S. Manufacturing PMI, along with September construction spending and the ISM Manufacturing Index for October. In September, manufacturing activity remained at a reading of 47.2 for the second consecutive month, and marking the 6th consecutive month in contractionary territory, or a reading below 50. This month, the ISM index is expected to tick up slightly, although still remain in contractionary territory at a reading of 47.6. And finally, on Friday, October total vehicle sales are expected to decline 0.4% to a 15.7 million unit pace. And on the Fed speak front, with the November 7th meeting right around the corner, Fed officials will be in their blackout period, leaving the market anxiously awaiting next week's rate announcement. While one data point is never enough to sway the Fed in one direction or the other, With only a handful of key data points over the next 10 days, each is viewed with an increased level of importance. As such, again, any further indications of an ongoing solid labor market, coupled with still elevated prices, will serve to underscore the need for a more tempered and patient approach to rate cuts going forward. And with that, I'd like to thank you for starting your week with Stifel.